our goal today, our targets are to talk about why podcasting can be an interesting and useful academic activity for you and your students to do together, why using the podcasts that exist in the world as classroom materials for content is useful, and why creating podcasts for students can be an interesting and relevant and challenging assessment option for you if you're looking to broaden outside of the typical assessments that teachers tend to do, like writing assessments or written exams. Doing podcasts can really reframe the way that you assess students in a lot of ways. So, why podcasting in the classroom? Then we're going to talk about podcasting prompts. So I'm going to give you some examples of things that I have personally done in my Mizzou Academy World Religions class. I'm going to provide a sample rubric, and then I'm also going to give you some resources for how you can do these activities with students and how you can help students with the technical aspects of making podcasts themselves. So those are my goals, my targets for us today. Like I said earlier, this is the tip of the iceberg material. And so this is just kind of a starting point. So for me, this is me. There's a picture of me without my glasses, which is funny to see. So I'm Greg Soden. For anybody in here who doesn't know me, I lead the World Religions, Humanities, debate in Brazil, and I also do some world history for the global side here at Mizzou Academy. And my guiding question today is, how can you use podcasting in your teaching? So we're going to talk about how podcasting assesses important academic skills, how podcasting is an option for you as teachers to branch out in your assessment. And we're also going to talk about how podcasting can facilitate creativity. One of the main critiques that students often tend to parrot to teachers is that schools don't foster enough creativity. So this is one of those things that to me really backs up what folks like, Ken Robinson have been talking about for the last 15 years or so, where schools aren't creative enough. I think that this is an excellent idea and possible response to such critiques of there not being enough creativity in schools. So I make podcasts myself. I've been doing it for a long time, and these are the cover logo artworks for my podcast. In 2017, I started a podcast myself called the Classical Ideas Podcast. You can see the logo on my head on the left side there. And it was a classroom project. And the reason I started this is that in my religions class at a former school that I taught in, I would have about 20 to 25 guest speakers per year come and talk to my students in a school. And they were various, religious practitioners, clergy, professors, scholars of religion who would come in and essentially give presentations and answer student questions. So it was a really fascinating experience to have guests who are experts and practitioners of religions come in and talk to students directly. And because they were offering stories about what religions were like from firsthand practical experience, but also academic experience. So they were able to offer an inside look into religious traditions of the world that were extremely interesting to me. And the students would ask the most profound and interesting questions during these presentations. And one of my students to me one time said, I really wish we had that conversation recorded. I think it was, I had a former Rinzai Zen Buddhist priest come in and talk to students about what their life was like as a Zen priest. And the conversation was so interesting that one of my students said, I wish I had that conversation recorded. So I was like, well, that'd be interesting to have the entire thing recorded and make it available. So I went to the principal and I said, can we record these sessions? And the principal said, Well, if you get every single student's parent to sign a release form to record in the classroom, then you can. And I was like, okay, well, that seems really difficult. And so I decided to create the podcast as a way to interview my own guest speakers who would come and talk to the students, record the conversation between me and that guest speaker, put the conversation online, and make the interview available to parents so that I could always email parents and say, next week in religions, we are talking about Zen Buddhism. And here is an interview that I did with the guest speaker. So if you and your student listen to this interview and they meet the person in my classroom, and then you talk about it over dinner or at night, and then you tell me what your conversation was like, you can get extra credit. So the whole entire podcast started with just me offering extra credit opportunities to students, but also to get the parents involved in the class. And that's how it began. And so I did the first 20 or so with just my friends who were my guest speakers in my class. And it just kind of kept going. After about 20 or 25 episodes, I started interviewing authors and professors and journalists. And to date, there are over 250 interviews that I've done for these for this podcast. And then in 2022, there's a network that makes podcasts about books called the New Books Network, and they republished my entire catalog of interviews because the conversations are about books that come out on presses like Yale Press and Harvard Press and Stanford Press, books that with a very low publication total that very few people in the world will ever read because they are not on trade press, publishing companies. So this podcast is a way to kind of keep the conversations alive and to preserve the conversations about books. So that's how my project started for myself. And it has been such an intellectually and mentally rewarding experience for me to make podcasts that the inevitable result is that I was like, well, I wonder if the students would like doing this too, because this is something that's so intrinsically interesting to me that I've done it for no pay for 6 years, just as a hobby. And I found it to be so rewarding that I was too tempted to turn it into a assignment for Mizzou Academy. So, I mean, here's an article from the Columbia Missourian where the podcast was featured on the front page of one of the local newspapers. So that was pretty cool to have the podcast recognized in the local news. So if you ever come to Columbia, Missouri, at Mizzou, you can find this newspaper at newsstands around the city. So there's me a few years back getting featured in the newspaper. So that was a lot of fun. So if you have a favorite podcast, I love podcasts. And if you have a favorite, I would love for you to put it in the chat. Put some titles of podcasts that you like in the chat, because I am a runner and I listen to podcasts when I run. So if you have any suggestions for things that are like series that you love or interview shows that you love or anything like that, I would love, love, love to know your favorite podcast. So put those in the chat, please, so that I can look at them in a little bit. So for anybody who doesn't know what a podcast is, a podcast is a series of audio episodes on a related topic, often in the form of talk radio, interview, oral histories, storytelling, etc. It can be about any topic. It can be extremely niche and very specific. For example, my podcast is just about the world's religions and books that are released about the religions of the world. So I've done episodes on Sikhism and Buddhism and Jainism and Baha'i and everything that you can imagine at this point. So that's what a podcast is. It can be made by anyone with a smartphone. It can be made with more sophisticated audio equipment. There is virtually no barrier to who can make a podcast. You can podcast directly into a smartphone in an app, and it is immediately published to Spotify. There is virtually no barrier to entry into this medium. And it is estimated that around a third of Americans listen to podcasts regularly, and about 440 million and counting people in the world listen to podcasts. So this is a medium that is with a very low barrier for entry, and it is growing, and it is niche content that is created for very specific interests. And that's what mine is too. It is there was no barrier to entry. I signed up for an account on a hosting service. I bought a microphone that I'm actually talking into right now. This is my entire podcasting setup right now. I use Zoom. I use this microphone that I'm talking into that you can see on my camera, and these headphones, and that is literally it. If you need any gear suggestions, I will be happy to provide them. So, for you and your students, creating podcasts can help you organize and communicate, build key writing and speaking skills, and learn recording, editing, and publishing skills. These are all digital literacy skills for 21st century learners. And my favorite thing about my students' podcasts is that since I teach my classes online, my students are in Panama and Vietnam, and they're in Germany, and they're in California, and they're in Florida, and they're in Missouri, and I get to hear their stories from all over the world. So I get to hear the lived experiences of my students told in their voice with first-person perspectives. So I get to learn about what my students' lives are like in Germany and in Panama and in Honduras. And it's truly incredible. And some of my favorite religions episodes that have been made by my students in Vietnam, whose surroundings on a day-to-day basis could not be more religiously different than what I experience here at my home. So whenever I get, American-made podcast episodes, when students talk about their day-to-day context, it's so much different than what students in other countries turn in. So hearing the variety that students turn in is totally incredible because I get to learn about their lives. So it also helps students feel like they have a voice because they are creating original content and they're telling stories, which is so fun because students find their voices as academics and as creative, curious people. So podcasts can also enhance accessibility for students because not only do they submit work that is written, they also submit work that is verbal, and they get to understand just how challenging communication skills can actually be in the world. So it's something that, enhances something. Instead of just being written, it's also heard and spoken, and it challenges students to be clear, first of all, in their writing and planning, but also in their presentations. So the skills that are used mostly are writing, research, interviewing, editing, and recording. So if there's any other skills that you can think of, if you have any ideas on why podcasting sounds like an interesting medium for you, I would love to see any ideas in the chat. Like if you wanted to elaborate on any of my main points, just say, oh, I see this third bullet point, and here's my reaction to that. Definitely put some reactions or thoughts in the chat at any time if you have a reaction to a specific bullet point, because then I can reply to it directly later on, and I can shoot you an email and we can have a further conversation about some of the main points. So here is a basic how-to. So this is something that I would say that if you're planning a unit, this is what you would do with your students to explain the whole process. Like we always talk about the writing process for, researching and outlining and making citations and the whole entire process of drafting for a formal written assignment. And this is something that you could put up on a screen for students that will be helpful for them to understand what the process looks like and how it varies a little bit from the writing process of making essays. So, step one, choose a topic. What is the student interested in? What is the class about, and how does it relate to the student's own interest? So, choosing a topic and helping students brainstorm ideas is a really great idea. And then step two, what is your format? Are you going to tell a story? Is it going to be an oral storytelling thing? Is it going to be creative writing? Is it going to be an interview where they find somebody and they talk to them and have a conversation? Is it going to be one host? Is it going to be co-hosted? What kind of format would you like to encourage? So then once they have a topic, and once they have an idea about what their podcast would be like, then it's time to learn about that topic. Research. What do you already know, and how can you take that deeper? So finding sources, doing a little bit of reading. My students often report on current events in the world, so I am constantly challenging them to find up-to-date news articles about things happening right now and reporting on them for their World Religions podcast series. And then step four, outlining and scripting. I hugely discourage my students from improvising 3 of their 4 episodes. There are 4 episodes in the series that my students make, and I hugely encourage them to outline and script episodes 1, 2, and 3. And the reason for this is because students will oftentimes go on meandering tangents in their recording, and they will be trying to make a point, but they will be underprepared. So a point often ends with, and yeah, and then they move on to their next point. So in my course, I am pretty rigorous about having them script and outline their podcast episodes for their first 3 episodes. You'll see why episode 4 is different momentarily. Step 5, recording. How do you record podcasts? Zoom has a wonderful built-in call recorder. It is so simple to use, and it's very, very easy, and everybody can do it. And there is a difference in Zoom recording if you have a free account versus a pro account. So time matters in Zoom, but there's also handheld recorders that are built into iPhones. So you can use the iPhone voice memo recorder, which is a perfectly fine recording function. You can do a Skype call recorder, which you can download for free, or there's also pay versions. And there is a variety of ways that you can record things. So how are you going to record? And then step 6, editing and production. So how are you going to produce it? And I have a link down at the bottom from the New York Times about how to make a podcast that matters. And this is a link that includes links to 20 plus student-made podcast series that have been critically acclaimed and highly reviewed. So if you are looking for publicly released examples of extremely well-made student-made podcasts, the New York Times article in the chat and also in this presentation is something that I would encourage you to read later. So here is my podcast series that my students do. There is a 4-episode podcast series live right now at Mizzou Academy in the World Religions Global course. I have them broken down into 25 points per podcast episode. And this is the series right here, these 3 bullet points. So the first episode is just the students saying why they are taking the course, what their personal goals are for taking the course, reflecting on their own religious experiences in the world if they choose to do so. There's no compulsion to force students to share any of their personal religious affiliations. If they choose to not, that's 100% fine. And I would say that it's about 50-50. Some students go very in depth on their own lives just as an exercise in reflection. And some students just kind of say what they see around them in their town. So the first episode is about what is religious literacy to the student. So why does learning about religion matter? Then I do 2 episodes in a row that are identical in format. This Week in Religion is what I call it. And this is a synthesis of current events reporting with personal analysis. So this is my favorite little sequence because it is purposefully renewing. It automatically renews to be current. So a student can read this assignment in 2020, they can read it in 2025, they can read it in 2030, and this assignment constantly renews itself because the way I've written the assignment is they have to research events in the world the week that they are doing the assignment and report on it. So if they wanted to report on something involving Hindu traditions, they would go to a current events news site, go to any, internet search tool of your choice, go to the news tab, type in the name of the religion, and find out what is happening in the world that week about that religion. And then there is a format that students report on. So they do 2 of these series. They do 2 of these episodes in the series where they report on something happening that week in the religion that they are reporting on. So I love the fact that this one is a current events-based thing because it keeps the assignment fresh and shows the students that religion is happening all around them, whether they practice it or not. So this shows you that religion is absolutely everywhere in the world, regardless of how you personally interact with it or don't interact with it. And then the last episode in the series is an interview with a religious practitioner where students create a primary source by interviewing someone of their choosing about their religious traditions, practices, and life. So there's a few ways you can go about it. Some students have interviewed scholars of religion, like I do on my podcast. Some students have interviewed local clergy. Some students have interviewed friends. There is really not a lot of boundary to who students are allowed to interview. I've had students interview Zoroastrian folks. I've had students interview Scientology folks. I've had students interview people who mix African indigenous traditions with a more modern Christianity. And so it's an interesting variety of assignments that students turn in to see how people practice their religions in the world. And then these conversations oftentimes wind up, I've had students turn in interviews that are 45 minutes long that I essentially just turn on in my kitchen while I'm doing dishes or something like that. And I listen to these amazing conversations that students, are working on. So Bert earlier had a comment in the chat that was talking about interviewing, and there is an Edutopia article in the chat that Angie just put in about how to conduct an interview. So here is a direct source that students can read, that you can read in class, that you can have students annotate and write ideas on and have a class conversation about. You can turn this article into a critical reading activity where this is like how to conduct an interview. What do students need to know if they are going to interview people? So there's a little source for you right there that I read the other day. and really enjoyed. Okay, so how do students plan it? I've come up with a planning document that is included here. This is directly from my course. So you'll see that there is a script and boxes that students can fill in. And this outline requires sources, it requires summarizing, it requires background research, it requires a personal response, an introduction and a conclusion. And in my course, I oftentimes encourage students to put introduction music and conclusion music, like it's like on an NPR radio broadcast or something like that, where it's like, welcome to World Religions with Matt. And there's music playing in the background. And it's really wonderful because I provided a link to a website that I can put in the chat here called bensound.com, which is a free sound library where you can, get publicly available and accessible music that is royalty free, that is available free of charge to absolutely anybody. That can be the background sound or transition music within a podcast episode. So you'll see here that there are guiding questions at the top. In each gray box, introduce yourself, give the name of your podcast series, the name of your episode. So it's, hello, my name is Greg Soden. The name of my podcast is World Religions. And this episode is about religious literacy. Boom, introduction, done. You might also include a brief rationale for why you were making the podcast. I am making this podcast for my World Religions course at Mizzou Academy. Boom, done. That is a common intro that I hear from students that they do time and time again. Section 2, summarize an article. This is the current events this week in religion rubric. What religions are involved? Where in the world did your event occur? What is the essential information listeners should know about the article? So this is where students have to write their script about what they learned in the article. Section 3, contextualize the article. What background information can you give listeners to provide context about the article? So if there is something about Buddhism, this is where students might give an overview of the life of the historical Buddha and the main Buddhist teachings that they learn in the content of the course. And that's how they can contextualize the modern example that they find in the news. Number 4, respond to the article. This is where students say why they chose the article, what else they would like to know about the events discussed in the article, and who you could ask for more information about the events discussed in the article. So it's basically setting themselves a goal for further learning. And then section 5, conclude your podcast. Thank your listeners. Give the appropriate attributions to your media sources. So thank you so much for listening to World Religions. This is Greg Soden. I am really delighted that you all listened to my podcast today. Thank you so much for being here. The article was used from the New York Times, and the background music was provided from bensound.com. Boom. End of podcast episode. Okay. So this is just an idea for how, rigorously I have students plan their work, and I give guiding questions for every section so that there is a flow and a sequence to their presentation, and so that their episode is not meandering. It does not drag on. It does not, go off on tangents. It is organized, clear, specific, in and out. These are about 5 minutes long usually. Okay, so here is the rubric. This is, I give them 5 points for their script. I give them 7 points for their content, and the content is all the information in their episode. I give them 5 points for choosing good source material. I give them 5 points for how they produce it. So I fully realize that grading on production is kind of an interesting choice. If a student turns in something that they record on an iPhone in voice memos with no background music, what I'll do is I'll take off 1 point and I'll give them 4 out of 5, and I'll give them some tips on how to enhance their production for the next episode. But I've listened to a few hundred of these at this point, and I've never, torn a student apart on production for turning in just an audio recording. I just try to encourage them to up the ante a little bit. So that's an example of a rubric. If anybody has any questions on rubrics or outlining or scripting, feel free to put those in the chat, or just ideas in general. Okay, so far we talked about how to choose topics, how to outline and script, and how to do a rubric. Okay, so here are some more practical things. How to podcast. So this is on the left here, you'll see Grace Plus Influence. This is an actual podcast from one of my students. I've redacted her last name, but you can see World Religions at Mizzou Academy. Listen on Spotify. This is a podcast that the student has chosen to publicly release that is not required in the course. Oftentimes students just submit an MP3, but students who are very proud of their work and want to put it out there often publicly release their work. So you can actually find this student's podcast series on Spotify by going and searching Grace Plus Influence. And she has made that choice freely and in an informed way. So you can see her series here at the bottom, World Religions, Grace Plus Influence, episode 1. And it says, today we are going to sit down and talk about the concept of religious literacy and its importance. And then episode 2, so her first episode is, if you look right here where I'm circling, 8 minutes and 28 seconds. I mean, this is an intensely prepared piece of work from the student. And then episode 2 is Buddhism in China. And this is a current events article that she did February 16th, 2023, and it's 5 minutes and 11 seconds. And her little blurb is, today we cover a recent event that surrounds the presence of Buddhism in China. And Lisa has a question. How much feedback and suggestions are you giving students as they work on their script? Not a lot. It's been really interesting to me how few students have actually reached out for feedback on a script in advance. It's probably happened 24 times or so, but it's always on episode 1. There's a frequent amount of questions that come to me from students on episode 1 as they're working on it. But then I've rarely had students come back and ask for advice and feedback on their scripts for episodes 2, 3, and 4. It's really fascinating. For episode 4, where they interview somebody, they're often asking if a guest is an acceptable guest. And it's almost always yes. If it's something where, there's any controversy, any public controversy surrounding the religious community that the student wants to interview, I'll often, go over some of those concerns with students and make sure that their parents are okay with it. And so the feedback and suggestions often come on episode 1 because they've never made a podcast before and they have questions. And then more feedback usually comes on episode 4 with who they can interview and who is an acceptable interview guest and what they might need to know before they go and interview somebody. So I've actually had emails with parents before about some concerns they had about the interview guests that the students are interested in. And it's definitely a good conversation to have with students. So thank you for that question, Lisa. I appreciate it. So if you go to Anchor, Anchor is a free podcasting app for public podcasting. Users must be 13 years and up. Angie has put a how-to podcast on Anchor YouTube link in the chat. It is so easy to use Anchor. Half of my students use it to make their podcasts for my course. You can choose your own device that you record on. You can use Anchor on a desktop computer. You can use it on an iPad. You can use it on a smartphone. It is a widely accessible app for creating public podcasts that publish publicly to Spotify. You can switch between devices to work in multiple locations. So if you start a project on an iPhone and you finish it on a desktop computer, it seamlessly works between all these different platforms. Each screen on Anchor has very easy to understand instructions for students. So if your students were working in a group, they could do a easy group project where they seamlessly work together across the platform. You basically record, drag, drop, publish. It's that simple. And they provide free transition sound effects for podcast episodes. So Anchor is a slam dunk, super easy to use platform that my students have virtually no technical issues with whatsoever. So here is another option for making podcasts. And this is a recording option where students will make and edit something and then send it out to their send it out as an MP3. So Angie is putting some links in right now. I have an episode or a video there, how to make a podcast in GarageBand on an iPad, how to make a podcast in Audacity on a PC. And then there's also how to make a podcast on GarageBand, like on a desktop. So these are some built-in free recording softwares. GarageBand comes automatically loaded on every single Mac computer. Audacity comes automatically loaded on every single PC computer. So these are free. And you can download them. If they aren't on your computer, you can download them for free as well. I have personally made over 400 podcast episodes in GarageBand, and a basic audio file in GarageBand looks like the screenshot that I have included on this page. So you'll see here that there's two files. This one at the top that I'm pointing to with my mouse is music. This is introduction music. Notice that it starts out loud and then it fades down, because this blue file underneath is me giving an introduction. So when I start talking, I make the music fade down in volume so that my voice is louder than the music, but the music is still there. And then the music fades out entirely as the interview with my guest comes in right here. So this big orange file is my interview. Notice I have a couple of splices here. These are where my guest had a flub where they asked me to edit something out. So these cuts right here are edits that I did simply by highlighting the file, putting the cursor right on the spot, and then hitting Command T on my keyboard to create the splice. So that is what a basic recorded GarageBand looks like. So I would love to hear your ideas. Brainstorm a series in the chat. I would love to hear your content expertise. And if you have an idea for how you might assign a podcast series or an episode in your classes, does anything spring to mind? Your favorite novel that you teach about, your favorite scientific curriculum where students become researchers and they report on something. What is a series idea that you have? There's no wrong answer. I would love to see any ideas that you may have as far as what podcasting can look like in your classroom. Angie says it would be fun to do dinner with a person in history. That would be amazing. Because think about that. Say you had a script. You could write a creative script. It would almost be like a play, an audio drama, if you will, where each person has a character and you essentially write the script and then you record it, and you could weave in background sounds of like the table being set or the table being cleared by like a server in a restaurant. And you could put in ambient sounds in the background of restaurants of people talking to each other. And it would be almost like there was a tape recorder sitting on the table in a restaurant having a conversation with a person in history. That's a great idea for a series. That would be so much fun because there's no shortage of content. You could literally make a podcast series about a creative writing exercise where you do dinner with a person in history, you write scripts, and it could be 1,000 episodes. There would be no shortage of people that you could do. And that would be kind of an amazing history project as well, I think. Okay. So I've put a lot of links in the chat. There's a whole bunch. I would definitely encourage you to go and read some of those materials that I found. And remember, I invite you to send me any links that you may find. There is another link that Angie just put in there from teach.com, which is a how to use podcasts in the classroom. That is a great article because it talks about how to use podcasts that other people make as content in your classroom. Most podcasts provide transcripts at this point, which you can download, and you can play podcasts in the classroom while students read along on a paper copy of a transcript and annotate as they go. So you can use podcasts that exist in the world as content for driving conversations and assignments in the classroom. So you can use them as sources. You can have students podcast. There is no shortage of things that you can do. So here is a variety of podcasts that you can check out. I have elementary, middle school, and high school educational podcasts listed here that are very commonly used. And I put the subject area in each one. So you can see, what podcasts are out there that our teachers commonly use. So here's a good variety. So find your age group, see what there is. These are just a tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. And to add to this list, if you have ever used a podcast in your classroom and it is not on this list, or if it is, definitely put that in the chat as well. So if there's anything that you have ever used, I know a big common one in the US a couple of years ago was Serial, about an investigation. That was a really common one that people used on how to do investigative journalism and turn it into an audio storytelling. So if you have any ideas for podcasts that you've ever used or you've seen used or you've heard people use successfully, definitely let me know. Okay, so this is the end of the presentation. I am super delighted that you all were here and that you joined me for this overview of why podcasting is here to stay and how you can tie it into your own teaching. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. I can address it briefly. We've got a few minutes. And if you don't have anything, or if you think of something later, my email, I will put it in the chat, is sodeng@missouri.edu. So there's my email. I would love to hear from you if you have any ideas related to podcasting, related to audio, related to students becoming, budding investigative journalists, if you will, or storytellers. I love this kind of assessment and assignment. I think that it's one of my favorite things I've ever done as a teacher, and it has not gotten boring at all. I've been doing this podcast series in world religions for 2 years, and it has been a truly, truly remarkably rewarding experience for me. So thank you so much. Let me know if you have any questions.